of Manhattan. I don't know another direct cause to the low and no pressure that has been, vetted and confirmed other than what you hear from both firefighters and water civil engineers and leaders in Los Angeles, which was there was so much water necessary during this firestorm that it wasn't possible to keep the pressure up, whether it was in the Palisades or in Altadena.
Which does make one wonder why this fire was so bad and whether any amount of water or more firefighting resources, which also became a point of contention, as you know, whether that would have done anything to stop this firestorm.
It's why I start the book with a quote from the academic, the author, the intellectual Mike Davis, who in 1998, in his book Ecology of Fear, essentially asked that same question. He presented the case in Malibu that the experts were saying there's no amount of firefighters that would have stopped the wildland blazes that were happening in the hills above that coastal enclave at the time. And decades later, the same sort of story played out just down the road, so to speak, just down Pacific Coast Highway. The reality of the new age of disaster that we are living in is that these are unavoidable catastrophes at this point. And unless we understand that changes in the way we live, that our infrastructure falling apart, that the global climate emergency, and that the politics of misinformation and disinformation are all sort of converging to create this conflagration, excuse the expression, that's resulting in communities like Lahaina or the Campfire in Paradise,
Maui, right.
We'll never be able to move forward with a way to understand that this is the shared reality that we live in today.
Before we let you go, I do want to ask how you're doing. You wrote this book incredibly quickly, but you were also, I know, exposed to incredibly dangerous conditions. You inhaled, who knows how much smoke and toxic chemicals in the days that you covered this fire. You even write about a firefighter, Eric Mendoza, who collapsed once he finally got home because, as he said, his lungs would not expand. Are you okay?
Thank you for asking. Yeah, I feel fine. And the people to really ask that question to and about are people like Nick Schuler, the CAL FIRE deputy chief, who said to me this was the one fire he believed that he might get cancer from actually fighting. 1,000 electric car batteries, one senior emergency management official told me, exploded during the fires. I heard them myself. That's part of what's in the ground and what's in the lungs of the people who were there. And so I think a lot about them. I think a lot about people more than anything. And it's a story, this is sad and tragic what we're discussing, but it also makes me hopeful to have gotten to know those people, including other people who I'm concerned about too, like Kate Hennigan, the JPL engineer. Hundreds of her colleagues lost their home at Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the fires in Altadena. Herb and Lloyda Wilson, who I met, the UPS employees on McNally Avenue. Albino Fuentes, the Cafe Vita server in the Palisades. I mean, all of these people have individual stories to tell, and I hope in getting to connect with them, which I know was one of the great blessings of my life in doing this project, we can all sort of begin the process of healing and think about what all of us have gone through together.
Well, to that point, Jacob, how is the recovery going? If you were to walk around the Pacific Palisades or Altadena, what does it look like today, 1 year later?
A big hopscotch of a construction site. And, I think these events often expose the fissures that are underneath our society. One of them is the unaffordability crisis in Los Angeles. Many of the people who are trying to get back to their homes are not able to afford it. 40% of the lots, according to a study that I just read, are being sold to corporate investors and not to Californians, not to Angelinos. The recovery, 16,000 structures, as I mentioned, were destroyed. We're not even at a fraction of that in terms of having permits to be built, and not even a fraction of that fraction in terms of the houses that are back up today. It's a year. It's a short time, some might argue, in the span of disasters like this, but it's a lifetime for the people that experience this. And many of them may not end up returning to Los Angeles, or at least to the communities that burned in the Great Los Angeles Fires.
Jacob Soboroff's new book is called Firestorm, The Great Los Angeles Fires and America's New Age of Disaster. Jacob, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
It's Here and Now.
Funding for Here and Now comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston and MathWorks, creator of MATLAB and Simulink software for technical computing and model-based design. MathWorks, accelerating the pace of discovery in engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com. And CitySpace Productions, WBUR's creative studio for custom podcasts that tell a brand's story to ignite engagement, reach new audiences, or establish thought leadership. WBUR.org/creative studio.
It's Here and Now. If you use food stamps to buy groceries, your shopping experience now likely depends on where you live, because 5 states, Indiana, Iowa, Nebraska, Utah, and West Virginia, are restricting SNAP users from buying soda. Some are also banning candy and other desserts. And another dozen or so, mostly Republican-led states, will be enacting their own bans later this year. Let's bring in Helena Bodemiller-Evich. She's been following this. She runs the newsletter Food Fix. Helena, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Can you give me a sense of how significant or widespread these restrictions are?
Yeah, this is really a major change. The SNAP program has never restricted what kinds of food you can buy. You can buy any type of food as long as it is not hot prepared food. And you can't buy toiletries, you can't buy alcohol and tobacco. So allowing states to restrict certain foods out of the SNAP program, which serves 40 million Americans every year, is a huge shift in policy, and it affects millions of consumers.
Now, each state is slightly different. In April, for example, Florida is going to restrict purchases of soda, energy drinks, candy, and prepared desserts. Hawaii, a blue state, will restrict soft drinks later this year. What's motivating these states to do this sort of thing?
Well, one big reason is that the USDA is approving these waivers. In the past, they would not approve states asking to do this. And so we've really seen a major change in policy under Robert F. Kennedy and Brooke Rollins' leadership. Those are the leaders of HHS and USDA. They say this is part of the Make America Healthy Again agenda, or MAHA. This is a term people are hearing more.
Sure.
They argue that this is a way to try to make people healthier. They say that, taxpayer dollars shouldn't be used to buy low-income Americans foods that are not health promoting. Anti-hunger advocates really hate this idea, though, because they think it's unfair.
But isn't this the key question here? Like, would restrictions on what you can buy with food stamps actually make people healthier? What does the science say?
So it's a great question. We don't know, because we have never tried this idea. We have never tested it, and we have never studied it. So we don't know what effect it has on consumers. Do they simply use their cash to buy the foods that are restricted and it has no difference? Do they start changing their purchasing altogether? Does that affect health outcomes, or do they substitute for other products that are perhaps even worse? We don't know. And so one key piece of this is that USDA is requiring states to evaluate what happens in their states. So hopefully we will, in the next several months, have some data to actually look at.
How do you think this might change the experience at the grocery store? I'm thinking for the checkout clerk, for one, and for the people who are buying the groceries, who might say, wait, am I allowed to buy this donut? Does soda, is that the same as an energy drink? How complicated is this going to get?
It is definitely more complicated than it seems. Like, how you draw lines around these foods is not as simple as you might think. So in Florida, for example, they are restricting not just soda, energy drinks, and candy, but also packaged, highly processed desserts. But it doesn't include freshly baked desserts in the store. So like a Krispy Kreme donut was a question I had. Like, is that restricted or not? And you can see how a consumer would be really confused. And then the checkout clerk is the one who has to police it. They will have to send people back if they take food out of their order if it doesn't meet the requirements. And so there is the potential for a lot of confusion and a lot of increased stigma around using SNAP. This is really the concern that anti-hunger advocates have. They are really upset about the idea that we would make it perhaps more embarrassing or just increase the friction around using SNAP EBT, which helps 1 in 8 American households afford groceries each month.
We've had a few days since January 1st when some of these restrictions have gone into place. Do we know yet how the rollout has gone?
Yeah, I really haven't heard much yet. I expect in the coming days, we're going to start to hear more stories of what cashiers are facing, of what SNAP participants are facing. We really don't know yet. It's only been about a week. States have a roughly 90-day grace period to roll out some of these changes. And so it could be probably over the next month or two that we'll have a better sense of how this is working.
As you just told us, 1 in 8 Americans use SNAP benefits. I'm curious, do the grocery carts of people on food stamps look much different than anyone else's?
They really don't. Data consistently show that low-income shoppers on SNAP really don't have less healthy groceries than similar households that are not on SNAP. It's just one of those things where I think we have this idea in America that taxpayers shouldn't be buying certain foods. It's something I hear a lot from readers of my newsletter who will say, I support SNAP. I want people to get groceries, but maybe we should just be buying them staple foods. We actually do this right now with the WIC program, which is targeted at women, infant, and children. So that is, buying staple foods and infant formula. It's much more targeted. SNAP has always been a program where you can just buy groceries writ large. And now we're seeing more of a debate about whether or not that should be the case going forward. It is a $100 billion program, and so we're not talking about a small amount of money here. And we'll have to see where the debate goes.
Helena Bottomiller-Evich runs the newsletter Food Fix. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Here and Now is a production of NPR and WBUR. I'm Peter O'Dowd in Phoenix.
I'm Deborah Becker in Boston. Have a great weekend. It's Here and Now.
Funding for Here and Now comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston, where the program is produced, and Viking, dedicated to creating travel experiences for the thinking person, with programs designed for cultural enrichment on board and on shore. Learn more at Viking.com.
I'm Deborah Becker. New York Mayor Zohran Mamdani has an ambitious plan to provide free childcare.
We will provide universal childcare for 3-year-olds, and we are going to start to provide universal childcare for 2-year-olds across the city beginning this fall with 2,000 children.
How might that idea work? That's next time on Here and Now.
What's a 5-letter word for a new puzzle game you can play every day? Introducing your new daily obsession, KUOW Newsword, available now in the KUOW app. You'll have 6 tries to guess a word related to a local news story. Do the puzzle, then check out the story from KUOW's newsroom. Play KUOW Newsword now on the KUOW app for iOS and Android.
KUOW would like to recognize members of the community who included a gift to this station in their will. You are hearing programming today thanks to the generosity of Robert Aldridge, Paula Bishop, Alice Blanchard, Dennis Braga, Donna Jane Gaffney, and others who left a legacy with KUOW.
Lakshmi Singh. Minnesota state and local authorities say they are launching their own efforts to collect evidence in the case of a lethal encounter between an Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent and a 37-year-old woman the officer fatally shot on Wednesday. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry, a Democrat, raised concerns a federal investigation into the confrontation is already compromised.
This is not a time to hide from the facts. This is a time to embrace them, making sure that we're pushing for transparency every step of the way. The fact that Pam Bondi's Department of Justice and this presidential administration has already come to a conclusion about those facts is deeply concerning.
Trump administration officials came to the agent's defense, saying the woman, Renee Good, hit the officer with her car as she tried to drive away. But there are conflicting accounts about what led to the shooting, raising questions about excessive use of force by ICE agents. The Supreme Court dashed expectations of a major ruling on tariffs or voting rights today. NPR's Nina Totenberg reports.
When the High Court announced earlier this week that it would hand down opinions today, word spread like wildfire that the court would announce a decision on the legality of Trump's tariffs, and newsrooms went on red alert. But when Justice Sonia Sotomayor leaned forward to read her opinion today, she looked over at the slew of Trump administration lawyers in the courtroom and observed, "Seeing who's here today, it's not the case you thought." So true. The opinion was about prisoners' rights. Nina Totenberg, NPR News, Washington.
The Trump administration is more closely examining public benefits fraud and creating a new position in the Department of Justice. Critics say there's no evidence for many of the DOJ's allegations, but NPR's Jennifer Ludden reports experts do see risk in the U.S. safety net system.
Many benefits are administered by states with federal money. Matt Weidegger with the American Enterprise Institute thinks that undermines the incentive to be super vigilant.
This is the same reasons why you don't wash rental cars, right? It really belongs to somebody else.
A lot of benefits also flow through private contractors, says Don Moynihan, a political scientist at the University of Michigan.
Once you make that choice, then that also invites more opportunities for bad apples.
Moynihan says the administration's drumbeat of unfounded allegations is politicizing the issue, but tackling real fraud is key to public trust in a system millions rely on. Jennifer Ludden, NPR News, Washington.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 255 points. You're listening to NPR News.
This is KUOW News. I'm Paige Browning in Seattle. Seattle Mayor Katie Wilson is condemning reports of harassment of Somali child care providers in the city. Local Somalis say they've been getting death threats and have had people show up on their doorsteps following allegations of fraud among Somali-run nonprofits in Minnesota. That's prompted scrutiny of businesses in Washington state.
There is no excuse for this kind of vigilante, justice, people going to Somali daycare centers. And we need to do everything that we can to protect people.
Governor Ferguson met with community leaders last month in response to threats against Somali immigrants. And Mayor Wilson says her administration plans to convene similar meetings. The Oregon State Attorney General has announced he's opening a formal investigation into the latest shooting involving a federal agent. Customs and Border Patrol agents shot a man and woman yesterday in East Portland. The Trump administration is alleging that the driver tried to run over agents after they stopped the two. The shooting came a day after an ICE agent killed a woman in Minneapolis. Oregon's Governor Tina Kotek has called both shootings unnecessary and a continuation of the Trump administration's, quote, cruel policies.
When a president endorses tearing families apart and attempts to govern through fear and hate rather than shared values, you foster an environment of lawlessness and recklessness.
On the heels of the shootings, Congressmember Emily Randall of Tacoma has announced she's co-sponsoring a measure to impeach and remove Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. A heads up for Seattle City Light customers, don't be surprised if your next utility bill is higher. A 5.4% rate hike took effect January 1st, so Seattle City Light says customers should expect their bills to be about $4 more expensive. This is KUOW.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Imaginable Futures, funding programs in the U.S. with the goal of ensuring young children and their parents get the education they need to thrive. Learn more at imaginablefutures.com. This is NPR.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Gabriel Spitzer, in today for Bill Radke. And this is the week of He Said, She Said. Or maybe They Said, They Said. The Trump administration says a woman shot by ICE officers in Minneapolis was a domestic terrorist, while local leaders literally called BS on that and describe her as a mom and a poet. Seattle police union leaders say the city is refusing to enforce drug laws, while the chief and the mayor say there's been no policy change. Washington's Department of Commerce says the state's climate law has eliminated millions of tons of emissions, while watchdogs say maybe move that decimal place over a couple spots. And the Huskies quarterback says, I'm going to transfer, while the UW lawyers say you're not going anywhere. All right, well, it's going to be pretty tricky to keep it all straight, and that's where we come in. Every week, we convene a group of clever people to help us sort through the competing accounts. And this week, that consists of Hannah Murphy-Winter, editor-in-chief of The Stranger. Hey, welcome, Hannah.
Thanks so much for having me.
Seattle Times editorial board member Alex Fryer. Welcome, Alex.
Hi.
And public affairs consultant Sandeep Kaushik, who podcasts at Seattle Nice and Blue City Blues. Welcome back, Sandeep.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's excellent to have all of you with us. And just a reminder to our listeners and viewers, we are streaming live on YouTube. You can come hang out with us and see us here in our Northwest Casual. Just go to YouTube and search for KUOW Week in Review. All right, moving into our top story. The city leaders in Portland are calling for federal immigration officials to get out of town after 2 people were shot yesterday by Customs and Border Protection agents there. Federal officials identified the victims this morning as Luis David Nico Moncada and Jolene Spetsabeth Zambrano Contreras, both from Venezuela. Details about the shootings are still trickling in. We really should emphasize that there's a lot we don't know yet. This, of course, comes against the backdrop of the fatal shooting in Minneapolis, where an ICE officer killed a 37-year-old American citizen named Renee Nicole Good. That killing brought hundreds of Seattleites out to protest the Trump administration's immigration crackdown and some renewed calls to abolish ICE. And meanwhile, masked ICE officers reportedly made arrests in North Seattle yesterday, taking 3 people into custody and drawing condemnation from Mayor Katie Wilson and Governor Bob Ferguson. So all this is playing out in the first week of 2026. I just wonder, my panelists, where is your head in all of this? How are you processing these stories? Sandeep, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Well, first of all, that we're seeing these kinds of tragic situations like what happened in Minneapolis and maybe in Portland as well. It's also unnecessary, right? This is all downstream from the fact that Donald Trump and his administration have essentially quite openly declared war on blue cities and the cultures that prevail there, and so has responded in this excessive, draconian, authoritarian way of deploying these masked ICE agents, or in some cities he tried to deploy the National Guard. And so everything that's happened recently is downstream of those, I think, really bad decisions, right, on the part of the Trump administration, and so it's tragic and it's unnecessary. Right?
Hannah, what are your thoughts, and what do you make of the local response to these tragedies so far?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see a clearer message from especially our federal representatives like Murray and Jayapal, positioning state level governments as an oppositional force to the federal government. I think it's an important shift. That said, I think Katie Wilson's message yesterday really got to the heart of it, which is that this is a new paradigm. We don't have tools on a local level to really push back against the federal government. She talked a lot about needing to find creative solutions because these tools don't yet exist. I'm glad we're starting to have those conversations. They feel a few months too late. But I do think it's an important tonal shift.
Well, it's fascinating to see, which leaders choose to push back, which leaders choose to take a slightly more conciliatory tone. I mean, it even makes me think about what the leaders in Venezuela, how they behaved this week in response to the capture of Nicolas Maduro. They have clearly chose a slightly more moderated path. They didn't come out swinging as compared with, I don't know, say the folks in Minnesota and Minneapolis, who seem to have basically, really let fly with expletives and everything. I don't know. Alex, what do you think about the local response?
Well, I think it's been appropriate. I mean, this news and developments that we have are just make me sad and anxious and depressed. I think, like most of us, Patty Murray has been just a stalwart champion of this state and for the rule of law in Washington, D.C. I'm a little bit worried about her mental and emotional health because I think it takes a toll, but she's been a great voice for reason in Washington, D.C. And I think here locally, I think there are some subtleties involved. I mean, you had the mayor of San Francisco get on the phone and talk to Trump, apparently have a conversation in which at the end of it, Trump was not going to put troops in San Francisco. So I think that's a model of how to diffuse these obviously tense situations. Of all the statements that I saw come out from local officials, I did think that Councilmember Bob Kettle was right on in saying that, look, federal law enforcement have the right to conduct duties within the city. That is their right. You can't stop that. But you don't have to have local police to cooperate with them, and they're not. And I think you can decry the lack of professionalism and standards that we've seen in our federal law enforcement and ICE and Border Patrol. The masks and all the rest are totally counter to the kind of culture that we're trying to develop at Seattle Police, where you have body cameras and all the police are clearly identified. And so I think you can make that clear distinction between the law enforcement we're seeing coming from the federal government, the law enforcement that we have here locally, but to also understand that they do have a right to come in here. And I think we need to understand that so we don't get into a situation where it is unduly confrontational and people get hurt or lose their lives.
That's right. And just really, I mean, the federal government obviously does have a right to, ICE agents do have a right to make arrests in the city of Seattle, like the arrest they apparently made on Aurora Avenue. That said, they don't have the right to operate with impunity, right? And without any kind of checks or consequences on their behavior. And the really troubling and unfortunate thing about this situation is that they are supposed to be answering to the federal government and the Department of Justice. But does anybody here believe that Pam Bondi and the department, look at what happened with the Minneapolis shooting. The first response was for them to declare the woman who died to be a domestic terrorist before any investigation, before looking at the facts, basically exonerating the ICE agent who made the shot without, the prejudging the outcome of what's going to be a case. So again, that's where, yes, the federal government has rights, but they don't have rights to, to kind of gun people down in the street. Right?
Well, clearly they don't, and that's why elections have consequences. That's why the midterms are coming up. I think we need to see some activities there that hopefully will switch the House and we'll have some more accountability. You don't have accountability in a federal government right now. They've already made their conclusions, and obviously that's been decried by the folks in Minneapolis to say local law enforcement should have a role in investigating that shooting. Obviously, they should.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, but elections shouldn't. The consequences of an election shouldn't be someone being shot in the street by a federal officer. I think that traditionally, yes, the federal government has a right to put law enforcement in our cities. But we aren't in a traditional paradigm anymore. I think it's really important to note that the reason that we know about that ICE arrest is because it was reported to SPD as a possible violent kidnapping. That's what it looked like to an onlooker.
Right. What would you have thought?
Exactly. Yeah, right.
I think that goes to standards and professionalism. But I unless I'm hearing someone say, we should have our local law enforcement confront ICE in the
battle
streets.
It out
that is not a good idea.
Yeah,
so,
not a good idea.
Totally I think there's some things we just have to acknowledge that we can all lament the current conditions.
And we saw that play out in the case on North Aurora yesterday, where Seattle Police Department officers went and talked with the ICE agents, verified that they were federal agents, documented everything, but basically didn't interfere, just trying to bring some kind of transparency to the picture, since I guess, there's not a lot of transparency and accountability when they're wearing masks and nobody keeps records of what they're doing, right? Well, this whole thing has been inevitably drawing comparisons to the killing of George Floyd in 2020 and the sort of national outcry that it prompted. I wonder if you guys think it's a fair comparison and whether there's any lessons learned from that movement in 2020 that ought to be applied this time around.
That's an interesting comparison. I think that I would say that their origin comes from such a different place that I would hesitate to compare the two. I do think that the George Floyd protests in 2020 are something that is like that history is drawing Trump's attention to some of these cities now. I think that's the reason that our city's name is in his mouth on a regular basis. And so I think that those there's a common thread there that is bringing that federal attention to us.
So I'm very much on the record as a critic of sort of how blue cities and how sort of culturally progressive spaces responded to Trump in that previous iteration or era, and that era of 2020, when you combine COVID and the killing of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and the provocation of a national presidential election that was happening where Trump was on the ballot again, led to a moment of it was semi-hysterical. I think the reaction on the left. And look, Trump is a polarization machine. He provokes and drives people, but the reaction on the left that time was excessive. You had these protests that sometimes veered into violence and destruction of property, and certainly was politically counterproductive. So hopefully we're not headed back there, right? Like I do think there's a line to be drawn here about standing up against the authoritarianism and excesses of the Trump administration and what their agents are doing in some of these places, without, to what Alex's point, kind of taking it to destructive and counterproductive places, right? Like we're going to have to be not just reactive, but kind of smart and thoughtful about how we address the challenges that this hostile federal administration is creating in places like Seattle.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I do believe that there's a big role of protest here. And it's our right, and we should exercise that right. I do hope it's smarter and better than it was in that period of time. I will just say that there's one thing that did make me smile this week that's not related to some of the things we do at the end of the show, but it was the word rebuke that I saw in two headlines and talking about politics.
You like a good rebuke.
In a rare rebuke of Trump, U.S. senators' advanced effort to limit war-making powers. That was a good headline to see. House heading towards vote on to extend healthcare subsidies in a rebuke of GOP leadership. I liked seeing the word rebuke twice. And so I do believe that it's about elections, it's about politics, and hopefully we can turn this ship around a little bit.
And it's indicative maybe of the sense that even among the Republican, congressional delegations, and even within some elements of the Republican base, some of the excesses and overreach of the Trump administration are starting to provoke a reaction, right? The rebuke is actually coming from his own side in these two headlines you're talking about. That's an encouraging sign.
I do think, though, that you guys are presenting something that's a little bit difficult to square. You are talking about an authoritarian actions of a government, Sandeep, that and Alex, you're talking about acting through elections and acting through these traditional structures that were not built for authoritarianism. I think it is short-sighted to think that we can use the same tools, and this kind of goes back to the conversation about what local governments can do right now, using the same tools to try to work against a government that is not the same paradigm that we have existed in up until this point.
But here, Hannah, I'm going to push back on that, because this is where I think things went wrong in 2020 on the left's response to Trump, right? Because the left turned towards a kind of cultural authoritarianism in the era of the first Trump administration, of sort of saying, we'll use the tools we have at our disposal, which is sort of control of the culture and social media and some of those outlets, to impose ourselves from the top down on a whole bunch of institutions, a set of beliefs and values that were actually quite contested broadly in the, among the American populace and electorate. And that's helped, I think, to provoke some of the backlash that led to his reelection the second time around. So I really want to avoid a situation where we devolve and let's meet his authoritarianism with our own, right? Like that is just a race to the bottom, it seems to me. It's not an answer.
Whoa, that sounds like a can of worms.
Maybe it's provocative, but I this is sort of the locus of my criticism of our side in recent years.
Understood, right. And I think it's fair to say that the 2020, there was a broad mass movement with a lot of different pieces, certainly not monolithic and certainly not hierarchical. But,
and there's every reason to protest. To Alex's point, it's not that I'm not trying to say it was illegitimate to stand up and protest and say no, right? I'm there on these excesses and these, Trump is a huge stress test for American democracy, right? I mean, there's no question about that. But the answer to that stress test is to strengthen our democratic norms and institutions, not blow them up, right? Like, that's my point.
All right.
I would agree with that.
No. On that note, why don't we move on to our next story? This is the kerfuffle of the week, which is, I think, a copyrighted feature of this broadcast. In this case, I think it's an appropriate term. It says the outgoing head of Seattle Police Officers Guild said the city this week plans to stop making arrests for public drug use, and he slammed efforts to divert more of those folks into treatment programs instead of jail. He also announced that he's stepping down from his gig as union leader. Police Chief Sean Barnes says nothing to see here, that police can still make arrests when needed. And then meanwhile, Seattle's new progressive city attorney was sworn in this week, and she's promised to direct more offenders to law enforcement assisted diversion or the LEAD program when possible. So I could definitely use some help shepherding me through this story. What do we make of this? Is this like a tempest in a teapot? Is this a misunderstanding? Is this an indication of a real shift in politics in some way? Why don't we start with you, Hannah?
Yeah, I think it's really important to acknowledge why this tempest started, which was, and I really do want to shout out Erica Barnett at Publicola. I think she broke this down really beautifully earlier this week. So it started with a memo from Erica Evans to her own team, an internal memo, saying that they would be referring drug users to the LEAD team to see if they were eligible for the program. This was something she campaigned on. This should have been no surprise that it's an existing program. SPD then definitely overreacted to some degree.
Or Spog.
No, sir. First, there was an internal memo at SPD.
Okay. Chief Barnes.
Sending out an internal memo saying that all low-level drug charges were going to be diverted to LEAD. I Heart Seattle got their hands on that memo. They tweeted about it, and so did SPOG chief Mike Solon. And that's kind of where the pile-on of misinformation started. That was then reported by Como. Como reported his statement that he had released. But ultimately, Erica was doing exactly what she said she was going to do throughout the whole campaign trail, which was assessing access to the LEAD or the use of the LEAD program. Wilson had not introduced any new policy change, which she made very clear the next day. It doesn't represent a policy shift at all, or a significant policy shift. It's a small one, and it's not nearly as radical as anyone made it seem.
Does it suggest something about how this city and the police department or the police rank and file will get along? How they're going to be handling any daylight between their policy preferences? Alex?
Well, I think one of the things that came out of this whole thing is that people acknowledge that there's going to have a new leader of the Police Officers Guild. I think he said on his own podcast that he was going to be resigning, I think, next month or not renewing his election. But so there's an opportunity for a new Police Officers Guild head. That would be a positive thing. It's not for me to tell any labor organization who they should choose as their leader. That's up to them. But Mike Solon's had a reputation of saying sort of inflammatory things, and even against the department in terms of the lowering of crime rates in the city. That he didn't buy that. So hopefully there's someone that's a little more enlightened, a little more political, a little more polished. I think that'll be better for the officers. I think it'll be better for the city. There's one little thing about this whole kerfuffle about lead and all the rest of that stuff that made me a little bit troubled, which was the mayor, Mayor Wilson said that, if there was a policy change, I would have made a policy change. And so there's her saying like, hey, nothing's new here. You would have heard me say if there was something new here. And I appreciate that comment. I think I understand the spirit of it was made, and it was the right thing to say. But the city council makes policy changes, not to say like, oh, you're going to hear something from the mayor's office or from the city attorney's office about something as controversial and that had been so thoroughly debated in the city council as drug possession laws. So I just want to make sure that that is underlined and that we're not seeing this kind of like how are laws being enforced in the future? Is it by the police department? Is it by the mayor's office? Is it by the city attorney's office? When under this system of government that we have, it is the city council that makes these kinds of policy decisions, and it's up to the departments to fulfill those policies.
It's a good reminder for people like me who can never quite keep it all straight. Yes, Sandeep.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this was some people that are very, very skeptical of the new administration, both in the city attorney's office and in the mayor's office, sort of stirring the pot, right? The head of SPOG and others. And I do think it was a gross exaggeration of what is a relatively technical policy shift that actually happened here. I happen to have the new city attorney, Erica Evans, and Lisa Dugard, who's head of PDA, which is the organization that runs LEAD, on our Seattle Nice podcast. We were taping an episode this morning to talk about what exactly they mean by their new approach. And here's the basic understanding of it. Right now, the policy in the city of Seattle that was established in the drug law we created in 2023, that was passed by the city council, really does say for drug addicts, drug users, the fundamental police intervention should be to divert them into a program like LEAD, right? And even under Ann Davison and Bruce Harrell, right, 80% of all encounters that SPD has with people using drugs on the street, they are diverted to LEAD. And what they pointed out, the policy change, is that for this other 20%, there was no rhyme or reason for who was actually getting not diverted and prosecuted. It was often individual cop not following protocol and therefore making a referral to the city attorney's office and not, to LEAD, or, it wasn't like, hey, we're taking the worst of the worst and prosecuting them. And what they're saying is we're going to have a more thoughtful process going forward, a consultation between Public Purpose Dignity Action and the city attorney's office about what cases shouldn't automatically go to diversion and actually are subject to prosecution. And now there are questions about what is that standard then? And there's no hard and fast rule here. They say they do it on a case by case basis. And I think you could plausibly contest that maybe they're not, willing, they're too lenient about this and too reflexively willing to divert. What about the people that have been busted 5 times, 10 times, and they're still getting diverted and it's not helping? And now they say that they judge these cases on a case-by-case basis, and there are going to be situations where somebody's causing real harm in a local community, and in those cases, they're much more likely to prosecute that person just to give the neighborhood a timeout from this destructive behavior, right? But there's a certain amount of trust here that that they'll make better decisions. On the other hand, they're right that if there was no real standard before about who was getting diverted and who wasn't, then, maybe some kind of more thoughtful process is going to lead to better outcomes.
Yeah. Side question that maybe no one here has the answer to. I was curious when, reading Mike Solin's sort of missive, how dismissive he was of the LEAD program. He called it something like suicidal empathy. And I was just curious, do you get the sense whether that is a common sentiment in the rank and file, or is this a particularly fiery person shooting his mouth off?
I mean, it's hard to speak for the entirety of the rank and file. I will say, I do think there's been a lot of evidence that, there are a lot of rank and file cops that don't share the progressive beliefs and values of the populace at large in the city of Seattle. And we've had a number of incidents that go to the culture of SPD, right? And that it is out of step with the rest of the city. I think the mayor, the new mayor, Katie Wilson, has clearly put down a marker with the chief, Sean Barnes, saying that while she decided to retain him, he seems to be on a short leash. And I think what she said to him is that she wants to see signs of culture change at SVD. I think that's absolutely appropriate on her part to say that. I think there are cultural issues with SVD. So look, I mean, Mike Solon is the head of SPOG for a reason. They voted for, they elected him to represent them. So I think,
he's not a complete outlier.
He's not an outlier.
Well, I don't think we can't and we shouldn't speak to the entire rank and file of SPD. However, we can speak to kind of the collective action of the Police Officers Guild. And the Police Officers Guild has been generally resistant to diversion programs, to any sort of non-police options. There is a cultural resistance in the union's actions, and I think we can look at it from that perspective.
All right. I'm sorry, we're gonna have to wrap up the discussion on that one for now, but don't worry, we'll be back. We're gonna take a quick break, and when we return, we will talk more about the new crowd at Seattle City Hall and what we can expect from the new look City Council and the mayor. That's in just a minute here on KUOW's Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from Third Place Books. Historian Clyde W. Ford discusses his new book, A High Price for Freedom, Raising Hidden Voices from the African American Past, on Wednesday, February 4th at 7 p.m. More details at thirdplacebooks.com.
Only 11% of rental units allow big dogs. But what exactly is a big dog? The answer could mean the difference between life and death. Control F is a new KUOW podcast about the data that companies and the government track about you and me. Each episode, we dig deep on one question and show you how data shapes our daily lives. Join the search. Control F launches January 14th in the KUOW app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to Week in Review from KUOW. I'm Gabriel Spitzer, in today for Bill Radke, and I'm joined by Hannah Murphy-Winter of The Stranger, Seattle Times editorial board member Alex Fryer, and public affairs consultant Sandeep Kaushik. Well, Seattle installed new city council members this week, solidifying a progressive bloc and electing a new council president, even as they start working with newly elected Mayor Katie Wilson. And this is where, again, I could use some help reading the tea leaves here on how this is shaping up and what kind of politics we can expect this year out of City Hall. I wonder what you think about the new faces and what some of the more significant shifts you see coming on the council might be. Alex, could we start with you?
Well, I mean, there's definitely change at City Hall. I mean, I was just thinking about some of the candidates that lost citywide, Sarah Nelson and Ann Davison. Ann Davison being the city attorney, Sarah Nelson being city council president. They lost by huge margins. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to put a little perspective. In 2003, we had Strippergate. Does anyone remember that? Oh, yeah. That you had an organized crime figure wanting to rezone some property on a strip club, and the city council did that after some political contributions were made. The candidates that lost in that race lost by a thinner margin than the ones that of Sarah Nelson, right? I don't think Sarah Nelson did anything wrong. I don't think Ann Davidson did anything demonstrably wrong, but they certainly got sideways of whatever the prevailing political winds are in this city, and so that's going to be something in City Hall. I think that's the concerns that folks have about encampments, public safety, all those things are still there, and we'll see what happens. 7 of these folks are elected by neighborhoods and by district, and they'll have to face voters in a couple years. So I see a mix. I'm not sure I know exactly where City Hall is going, the City Council is going. I'm not sure they do either.
And the so-called progressive bloc that I mentioned, and of course these are broad labels that don't really necessarily apply as easily as we want them to, it's still only 3.5 people. It's not a majority.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think the conventional wisdom is that there's kind of 3, 3, and 3, right? There's 3 progressives, 3 conservatives, and 3 swing votes?
Swingers. We'll call them swingers.
Oh, maybe not. But what I'm excited about is I think that it will result in actual politics. We'll have actual robust conversation in council, I think. we're much more likely to see a much more engaged, active, debating council in a way that we haven't seen in a long time.
Do we think it's going to be more? I mean, do we think it's going to be high function? I mean, it's too early to tell. This is obviously all hand waving, right? But I mean, how much does it resemble the dysfunctional picture that, say, Tammy Morales painted when she left office a year plus ago?
Well, look, when this previous council took office after the 2023 elections, right, the conventional wisdom was we had this moderate supermajority on the city council, right, and they were all going to be in lockstep on everything. That turned out not to be true at all. I mean, aside from kind of questions of public safety and legislation where I think there was a moderate majority, on pretty much every other issue, it was quite fractious and unpredictable, and the splits happened in different ways, right? And so, we'll see about this council. Like Joy Hollingsworth, the new president, is a sort of consensus pick to run it, and she is in this sort of swinger group or whatever we want to call them.
Can we please find another name?
Sorry.
I'll blame Gabriel for that. But
representing the city's bluest district.
You could argue that District 2 is up there as well. That's in Southeast Seattle. But yes, one of the two very, very leftiest districts. But so she's going to have a challenge, right? Managing a council that right now doesn't seem to have any clear either ideological or factional kind of majority to it. On the other hand, it was kind of fractious this last council too, right? So I'm not super. I'm not thinking it's going to be some super different. The other thing, really quick, I will say is that I do think, given these massive electoral margins for the victory of the two city council candidates that got elected and the new city attorney, there is a danger here of the left over-reading the meaning of those election results. And I do think the last issue we were talking about with this blow up over this minor policy change about how we're going to do drug addiction, arrests and prosecution is a warning sign, I think, to the progressive left that if they go back to some of the policies of that kind of 2020 COVID era that led to the backlash that got the previous lefty council ousted, some of that public sentiment is going to come back pretty quick.
How is conservative misinformation a warning to the left right now?
Because what it's indicative of is that the shadow of that 2019 city council hangs over some of these folks. And remember, there was a real backlash
the
politics.
The chief, right. But he is a known.
I'm agreeing with you that in this situation, those claims were wildly overstated and exaggerated, but that they took such immediate root and got traction and kind of went viral is indicative of, I think, an anxiety and fear out there that the left will repeat some of the mistakes that it made in the not too distant future. And if they do, and if the condition on the streets of Seattle get visibly and noticeably worse, I think they will face the same backlash they faced a few years ago, right?
It also might indicate the role that right-wing media outside of the city, national right-wing media, that whole ecosystem could play in our local politics. I mean, that really inflamed it in this case, right?
There's a lot of BS and misinformation out there and exaggerate. We live in this very, not to use a big word, in an era of epistemic crisis, but also in an era of hyper-partisanship. And so there's a lot of the political sides ratifying their own worldviews and creating their own truths. And so, yes, it makes it a lot harder to sort fact from fiction in this era, for sure.
I want to go back to the original question about the kind of personality of council and how it might create, what we expect from these politics. I do think that it's you're right that there's a lot we don't know. We have the 3, 3, and 3, but we can, I think, look to kind of the spirit of how Joy Hollingsworth is approaching the role and how Katie Wilson is approaching the role. And I think they are very politically different people, but I think that they have both approached their roles as an extremely collaborative figures. And I'm really, really curious to see how that might play differently than the earlier council,
Yeah.
the previous council.
Alex, what are you kind of keeping your eye out for in terms of understanding how this council is going to function together?
Well, I think that's a good point, and so we'll see. I guess a couple of things that. This is in the sheer rumor department. There's probably ways you can verify this, but I had heard that the Unified Care Team in the last month that Harold was in office, when he was kind of treading water before his way out, wasn't cleaning up any encampments. That was not happening, and that you were hearing some. But the business districts in particular are saying, hey, we've got a problem here. And so that's going to be interesting to sort of see whether folks get on the phone to their council member and say, I want my basic services restored. I don't care what your label is. So that is interesting. I also think that Joy Hollingsworth, in her interview with KUOW, which I thought was a great interview, said something like about progressive revenue, because I think that's going to be another fight in front of City Hall. And she said, I don't want any more programs, basically. I want it just direct money to people, vouchers, universal basic income, and what have you. So I was like, well, that's interesting. See, I heard, to my ears, I was like, I've thrown in the towel on government programs. We cannot fund government programs very well. We don't get the outcomes we want. I just want to give money in people's pockets. That's a philosophical shift as well. So I'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, in the same interview, she also said that she wanted to push forward new what she called stabilization zones. It was she was supporting largely, I think, tiny home villages. And in that, her statements were very much at odds with one another. She did have a lot of ambition for pushing forward new ideas that require funding and require government spending.
Although tent cities are not a new idea. So I think we need sometimes we've been in these debates for so long, what seems new is actually something that's been tried before. But so, yeah.
Well, I think what Hannah's putting her finger on is that there is a looming debate that is coming in Seattle. I think the new mayor has also put down a marker on this, saying she wants to get people who are unhoused on the streets of Seattle into some kind of shelter situation. 4,000 over the course of her first term, she says, and including and starting very quickly on doing that, and that immediately runs into a resource allocation question and problem, because we've been having this debate about shelter versus permanent supportive housing for years now. And what we're seeing is emerging voices, whether it's Joy, the city council president, or the mayor, starting to say, we want to put more resources into creating shelter opportunities that will more quickly alleviate the problem of unsheltered homelessness and encampments on our streets. And so that's a shift, right? And that's a debate, and there'll be a fight about that.
One of the only other shift that I think we're seeing is that we've got the council president and the mayor explicitly saying the same priority at the same time, which is increasing emergency shelter. And I'm curious to see where that'll go.
All right. Thank you so much. All right. So obviously local politics that we'll be returning to many, many times over the course of 2026. Moving on now to another story, a data entry error. That's how state leaders are explaining a report that massively overstated the benefits of Washington's Climate Commitment Act last year. The Department of Commerce said a package of rebate programs that help low-income people buy energy-efficient appliances like heat pumps would keep something like 7.5 million tons of carbon out of the air. That didn't look right to a guy named Todd Myers. He's vice president of the free market think tank Washington Policy Center. And he checked the math. It turns out those rebates actually reduced emissions by something like 78,000 tons. So, again, a couple of decimal places off. How major was this blunder? How existential was this blunder? And what does it say about the state's ability to account for complicated things like climate benefits and the revenues generated by the Climate Commitment Act? Who wants to jump on that?
Well, I'll just jump on the issue of performance and outcomes, because I worked in government, and I will tell you, it is difficult to judge performance and outcomes. I think harder than it should be. This was a major error. I think the head of commerce said it was fat fingers, as in like someone's on a calculator.
Typo. Yeah.
But it was multiple accounts, right? And So I'm a big believer in the Climate Commitment Act. I'm a huge supporter of it. But you have to acknowledge when things you got to do better. You got to do better on those nuts and bolts things and make sure that if there's corrections to make, you make them transparently and quickly. And I don't think it's an existential threat to the CCA, but it is an absolute clarion call to do better.
Sandeep?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a huge embarrassment, and hopefully they're actually taking a hard look at what went wrong there, right? Because they should clean that up and fix it. But beyond the origins of the error itself is the question it raises about whether we are spending the really significant funding stream that the CCA creates in the best way possible to get the environmental benefits that we all want to get. And I think that raises some questions. 78,000 tons doesn't seem like a whole lot, in the grand scheme of things. And are there ways to better spend this money? That's another thing that I don't think Democrats and progressives should be shy about taking a look at to try to do better if there's better opportunity here. I will also say this: the timing of this was really inopportune. It's as we're going into a legislative session where there's a big budget deficit and where there are already lots of pressure to look at this huge pot of environmental money and say, boy, let's grab some of that to fund, other priorities where we've got big budget gaps. And this just feeds that.
Yeah, how does that play out, I wonder? I mean, what's the message we take away from this? That, it's a lot more expensive to reduce emissions, therefore we should continue spending it on climate mitigation? Or is it what's the point? Let's just take this money and spend it on K-12 education or whatever.
Well, I certainly, from the beginning of the conversation, before all of this came up, I would be the first to say that Ferguson shouldn't be raiding climate funding to fill budget holes. That was I would be one of thousands of people that said that when that first came out. I think it would be foolish to look at a clerical error and say that it means that we should radically change how we're approaching our emissions reductions. But this did take the wind out of the sails of what they thought was a win, and I think that's something that's worth it's worth looking at, taking a second to acknowledge that and look at that. This whole thing this all originally came from a conservative think tank. And that's something I think
the cap and trade sort of scheme you're talking about.
No, the finding of the error. This whole conversation, and the error was real. The hubbub around that, I can't help but look at that and acknowledge that it is, we have to recognize where the conversation's coming from. It doesn't call the program into question. It calls one report into question.
Well, I think that the low number sort of raises the question of,
Well, I understand the source has not been favored of CCA, but they just looked at the numbers and said, these don't make any sense. And
they did what
they
journalists
didn't.
are supposed to do.
It turns out they were wrong. So I don't look at that as then the whole thing is kind of tainted because it comes from a right-wing kind of conservative thing. They got them dead to rights on this. They had to come out and issue just a horrendous correction. And so...
Mm-hmm. And I get that raises the question, was it really just a clerical error? I mean, again...
Are you trying to imply that they tried to...
I don't know.
Conceal the efficacy of the program?
No, I don't think that they deliberately tried to cook the books, but there's some there's some pretty significant incompetence, right? That took place. Again, it's multiple programs, and not there was no one fact check. Was no one double checking the numbers before they issue stuff like this? I mean, they really need to clean that up.
I wonder, are we going to have an audit? Are we going to have some kind of a postmortem here that does get at that? Or head's going to roll at Commerce or what? It's hard to say. Alex?
Well, hard to say, but the notion of an audit, as I said earlier, performance and outcomes are really hard to figure out when you're in government. But audits are really important. Yes, this program should be completely audited. And we see that across government. We saw that in King County with the Department of Community and Human Services having audits that were very disturbing about how public money was being spent. Yeah, and it comes to an auditor coming in, taking a look at that. That's something government ought to do itself. It shouldn't have to have an auditor do that for them. But in this case...
Or to hear it about from some right-wing think tank.
Yes, exactly. So power to the audits. Let's keep them coming, but let's expect better from our local government.
All right. Well, we have a lot to learn. All right. Well, we're going to take a quick break, but stick around. We'll have more Week in Review coming up in just a few moments. We're going to run down some of the headlines that we haven't had time to get into yet so far and talk about what's making us smile this week. So don't go away.
Support for KUOW's car donation program comes from local Kia dealers, offering the Sportage Hybrid, an SUV with a turbocharged hybrid engine producing 232 horsepower. More info at kia.com.
I'm Tim Franks, host of BBC NewsHour. Coming up today, the Iran protests swell, dozens trapped in the Philippines by a pile of garbage. Colombia's president speaks to the BBC about Trump's threats, and the missing piece of African modern art.
Everything is expensive in Seattle, including the food. Where are diners eating to get the best deals? I'm Ton Venn, host of Seattle Eats, a food podcast from the Seattle Times and KUOW. And I've got a lot of answers to help you eat well in this city. Listen to Seattle Eats on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
It's Week in Review from KUOW. I'm Gabriel Spitzer here with Sandeep Kaushik, Alex Fryer, and Hannah Murphy-Winter. Time now to round out our discussion of the week's news with a look at some of the headlines we haven't gotten to yet. Please feel free to pipe up, panelists, if you have something to say. No pressure, though, totally optional. We'll start with Democrats in the State House of Representatives are floating a plan to have Washington redraw its congressional maps. This is the latest sally in the ongoing arms race between red and blue states, looking to add a few seats to their party's column. The Washington plan would require two-thirds majorities in the legislature and approval by voters, so it doesn't look like it's heading anywhere real soon, unless you guys disagree.
I think even the sponsor says it's not going anywhere. So, it isn't. But I mean, I guess my sense is like, geez, do we need more red meat? I think we've got enough red meat in our politics.
Right.
So,
you don't see this as a pragmatic. You think this is a political.
No, if it was sort of done with the intention that it's actually not real and it's not going to happen, I don't know if it adds much.
Our split in Washington is already 8-2. So I mean, maybe they could jury rig some map to try to squeeze out another one. But I guarantee you, if it actually started to move forward, some of the current Democratic incumbents in districts that are now safely Democratic but might become less so because they're trying to rejigger the lines probably would have something to say about this too. So I don't think this is going anywhere.
It's like a mutually assured destruction thing happening.
Exactly.
All right, moving on. The Seattle Times changed owners this week, but unlike some other big city papers, it wasn't scooped up by private equity or a big publicly traded conglomerate. It moved from one Blethyn to another. Ryan Blethyn took over from his dad, becoming the paper's 8th publisher since Alden Blethyn bought it in 1896. Alex, any big changes you're sensing over there?
Well, I think it's kind of too early to tell, as we've just said about the city council, but I think just a quick word for Frank Blethyn. He's been there for, since 1985 to 2025, a long tenure. And I think he had his critics, and that's to be sure, but no one can doubt his commitment to daily newspapers in the city of Seattle, and that, the Seattle Times had a bunch of property in South Lake Union and sold all that property, and he plowed it back into the journalism. And at a time when we looked at other cities like Portland, Oregon, that had an incredibly strong newspaper in the Oregonian, and seeing it being so diminished. If you guys have been into Los Angeles lately, the Los Angeles Times is a ghost of what it once was.
Once one of the great newspapers, and totally hollowed out, yeah.
Oh, it's just totally hollowed out. I mean, it's sad. The Seattle Times has cinched its belt as well, but you got to give credit for Frank for saying, like, hey, I'm going to save this newspaper. It's important to me. It's important to the community, and we wish him best.
And sort of particularly rings true in a week when the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette announces that it's going to cease publication.
I'm just super curious whether this means some changes in the editorial stances of the Seattle Times. I mean, yes, Frank deserves total credit for his commitment to maintaining journalism in the city of Seattle and a family-run newspaper. But he's also a opinionated guy who had some controversial views, and some of which were out of step with, I think, many people in the city of Seattle. And so Ryan is a different person, and running the editorial page I don't know whether Alex, this is a touchy area, I'm sure. But
I have no comment.
All right, moving on to some more headlines. We have star quarterback Damon Williams Jr. will continue to lead the Huskies for the foreseeable future. This would not have been news like a week ago since he's under contract and making millions. But this week he announced he would be entering the transfer portal, presumably for a better offer. Cue the outrage and the lawyers, and then long story short, he now says he's staying put in Seattle to continue his football journey here. And finally, I'll just mention that Washington continues to swell with newcomers. According to an analysis by the Times FYI guy of data from U-Haul, he finds that Washington has the 6th highest net in-migration among the states and the highest for a non-Sunbelt state. And you can compare that to like California, which has the highest rate of out-migration in this entire data set. Sandeep, you flagged this. What stands out to you about it?
Well, we're really bucking a trend in high cost of living blue jurisdiction. So that's great for us, but the larger national trend here of people leaving blue states and moving to red states is a real problem for our politics and for the Democratic Party.
All right. Well, we will, of course, be keeping track of all those stories and plenty more as we reconvene each week here throughout the new year. I want to take a few moments, as we usually do at the end of the show, to talk about something that made us smile this week beyond the weather. There wasn't really a lot of weather to make us smile, unless you're into that kind of thing. But Hannah, why don't we start with you?
I read this week that scientists discovered a new animal about 11,000 feet under the sea called a smiling snailfish. It is extremely floppy and silly looking, and it's worth a Google.
I'm going to look that up.
Fantastic. Is it a fish or is it a snail?
It looks like a fish.
Okay, I'll buy it. All right, Sandeep, how about you?
You know, mine is that there was news in the paper the other day that In-N-Out Burger creeps closer, slowly and slowly keeps closer. There's one that looks like it's about to open in North Portland near the airport, and Hannah was just telling me there's another one in Southwest Washington.
Yeah, in Ridgefield.
So look,
2 hours and 15 minutes
it may be
away.
a while before it gets to my neighborhood, but I kind of think like I'm probably going to get an In-N-Out Burger in Finney Ridge before we get light rail. So.
Those are good burgers, Walter. All right, Alex, how about you?
I've never had an In-N-Out burger, so I'll have to take your word for it.
Go to Vegas and have one. It's worth the trip.
I saw on the West Seattle blog that the J-Pod was out there. The orcas are out there off of West Seattle, and I live in that neighborhood, and so I walk down to the water every once in a while, and I see everyone in their binoculars and their big telescopic lenses looking at orcas, and I'm glad that they're there. I haven't seen one yet, but I'm glad that they're there.
Nice. I'll just very briefly mention, for me, what made me smile is I'm listening to the audiobook of Chrissy Hines' memoir. Ooh. And, she talks about her growing up in Akron, Ohio, and I'm from that area myself. I'm from Canton, Ohio. And she mentioned this one point where she had just gone to London. She's like 20 years old. She's trying to look cool. And she says that, in a fashion sense, I'm a victim of Summit Mall. And I so identify with that. It's like, yeah, just kind of trying to outgrow the Gap or whatever it is over there that it takes a lifetime to figure it out. All right. Well, listen, I want to say thanks so much to our panelists, the Stranger Editor-in-Chief, Hannah Murphy-Winter, Seattle Times editorial board member Alex Fryer, and political and public affairs consultant who podcasts at Seattle Nice and Blue City Blues, Sandeep Kaushik. Thank you all so much for being here. This show is produced by Kevin Kniestead. We had Kathy Faulkner running the board. We had social media help from Juan Pablo Chiquiza and additional support from Hans Tweit and Morgan White. I'm Gabriel Spitzer. We'll see you next week on Week in Review.